Yeah.
That's all right?
Yep.
All right. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Doyley, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'd love to see a good turnout. My name is Nolan Varee, and I am the researcher for the Rooted Project here at Villanova. On behalf of everybody involved with the Rooted Project, thank you so much for being here, and we're really, really excited to present this information to the Villanova community and get our project and our research out into the community more and more. So first, before we get into our presentation, just so you know, we're sort of going to bounce back and forth on multiple presentations here, but I just want to give a little bit of information on the project itself. So I'm going to introduce with who we are as the Rooted Project, what's our purpose, how we got started, and then we're going to send it over to Colin to talk about his findings and his research. Then I'm going to follow up, and then we can get into questions. But before we get going, obviously, just a content warning here. Our presentation revolves around issues of slavery and indentured servitude. So there are some heavy issues within our presentation, just so you know before we move forward. And we also wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. I think it's really important as we are in a location of Native American heritage, and also with our findings today. We acknowledge that Villanova is located on the ancestral homelands of the Lenni Lenape people. It is also located on a site of enslavement. So we just like to start that way. And if you have any questions or want to know more about the Lenni Lenape people, here are two sources that you can use. And I can get this for anybody who wants it afterwards. And we're going to keep moving to the Rooted Project. So the Rooted Project aims to explore Villanova University's past to come to terms with histories of slavery, segregation, institutionalized racism, and gender and religious prejudice. And this is a project that was started in 2020 after research was started by Angelina Lincoln, who is a former student in the history department here at Villanova. And in working with Dr. Judy Giesberg, Angie found, actually move forward, so Molden Hall here on campus. Molden Hall is actually named after William and Julia Molden, who I'm going to be talking about in my presentation. And so Angie found some information on the Moldens, and she started pulling the thread and finding more and more and more, realizing that this is a much larger issue to the history of the university than was previously known. And so her and Dr. Judy Giesberg were able to get funding through the president's office, and I'll mention our other funders. How do I get back? Perfect. Okay. So we currently funded in part by the Department of History, the Falvey Library, which hosts our website, which we really appreciate, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and Dean Lindenmeyer, and then the Office of the President as well. So thank you to everyone who puts forth some funding for this research. You can also follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Nova Rooted Project, and our website, which I'll be showing you a little bit later, is therootedproject.org. And then perfect. So part of Angie's research was picked up by the Philadelphia Inquirer in 2020, which was great for the beginnings of this project. And that sort of kicked off everything within the larger local community and here on campus to get the project started. So that's a little bit about the Rooted Project. I'm happy to answer any questions about anything else with the project in our Q&A session. But now I'm going to hand it over to Colin to talk about his research. And we're going to pass the mic.
Just Britney Spearsing it up, putting the mic on and. Okay, so hi everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm just going to set my timer so I stay to the time. So the first part of the research that we've been doing has shown that Villanova is located on a site of enslavement. So what does that mean exactly? Well, slavery is a part of Villanova's history. So in this section of the presentation, I'm going to detail how we know that, the sources that we use, some of the people who were involved, and talk about what slavery was like here. And then we have a picture of the campus. So Villanova, the land that we're on now, was originally owned by the Lenni Lenape people, which we covered briefly in the beginning. Then it was owned by a Welsh Quaker family named the Morgans. The Morgans owned two large pieces of property. We're in Radnor Township in Delaware County. One was 100 acres, one was 160 acres. It was mostly woods, and they had a farm and a few structures. We know all of this about the Morgans from tax assessments done by the county for how much property they had and how much they were required to pay. and also from deed records, which we'll talk about later. So that's how we know that this land was owned by the Morgan family, from two main sources, tax records and property records of deeds. The Morgans, in the 18th century, in the 1700s, the period we're talking about, these were the members of the family. This was the dad, Samuel Morgan, the mother, Magdalene Morgan. They had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I'm bad at counting, kids, 6 daughters, 1 son, and they were Quakers. So Samuel Morgan was the first enslaver, slave owner, to be in the Morgan family. He purchased a black boy named Jack from a white woman named Hannah Harrison in 1749. Is anybody familiar with the Harriton House okay, one person, okay, cool. The Harriton House is right here. This is a historic site which is located in Lower Merion, just like 5 minutes away from here. In the same time period in the 18th century, Harriton was the site of a tobacco plantation, and the Harrison family, Hannah Harrison, they enslaved approximately between 15 to 30 black people. So Harriton, we've also been working with them. They're reinterpreting their site to talk about slavery and to do more research at the site. We know that Samuel Morgan purchased Jack from Hannah because there's a slave bill of sale document. How many people have seen one of these before, a slave bill of sale? One? Okay. So these were the legal documents that made it official of a transaction of an enslaved person between two white people or a corporation or a trading company, or even governments were, buying and selling enslaved people. So just to walk through this document, this is what it looks like. This is located at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So I, Hannah Harrison of Lower Merion, that's the woman we just talked about, in consideration of the sum of 29 pounds, current lawful money of Pennsylvania, Samuel Morgan of Radnor paid it to me. So I'm delivering unto him one Negro boy named Jack, to have and to hold the said Negro unto the said Samuel Morgan, his heirs, executors, administrators, and assigns to the only proper use, blah, blah, blah. And it goes on and on and on. Obviously, just as another content warning and use of language, we're using terms like Negro, which are extremely offensive today, but we're using the historically accurate terms from the sources. So this is what a slave bill of sale looks like. This is one source of how we know that the Morgan family was enslaving this black boy, Jack. So then a few years later, Samuel Morgan also purchases another black person, this time a black woman named Chloe, from a blacksmith named William Milcor in 1751 in Tredyffrin Township. So here we are over here, Villanova. So we don't know exactly where he lived because the slave bill of sale doesn't specify, but it's pretty much the same kind of document that's outlining the transaction between the blacksmith and Samuel Morgan selling this black woman to Samuel Morgan. And she was worth, according to them, 35 pounds lawful money of the province of Pennsylvania. Okay, so this is what it looks like. So when we're interpreting this document, when we're reading this, first we have to read all of the 18th century cursive to make out what it's saying, and then transcribe it to get the words right, and then to kind of piece together, are these the same people that we're talking about? And we think, obviously, that they are. So Samuel Morgan died in 1759, and in his will, he bequeathed Chloe and Jack to his wife and his son John. So this is his will. The will is available online. Is anybody familiar with FamilySearch.com? It's kind of like Ancestry.com. It's a database that has a lot of primary source, meaning sources from a specific time period we're looking at, that are available to the public. So when we're reading Samuel Morgan's will, he bequeaths these two enslaved people to his wife and his son. And when a slave owner died, it was really kind of an uncertain time for enslaved people because slave owners could sell off enslaved people to cover a debt, or they could give them to other people as gifts. They really were unsure of what would happen. So we know that they were bequeathed to his wife and his son from the will, which we have an excerpt of here. Daily life for Jack and Chloe, it's difficult to piece together what it exactly would have been like here because there are few sources from the Morgan family, and there are no sources authored by Jack or Chloe themselves. So when we're talking about the history of slavery, archives, how sources were made and kept, and documents, I'm just going to shut this for a sec. Whoop. Slave owners really didn't want to record enslaved people as human beings or worthy of historical study or preservation. So it's difficult to piece together what exactly Chloe and Jack were doing on the Morgan's farm, which was in this space. But historians have studied slavery for decades, and secondary sources, meaning books and articles written by historians about this topic, tell us that they would have been doing agricultural and domestic labor, and that slavery was really violent, it was dehumanizing, and that enslaved people living in rural Pennsylvania, which this area was considered in the 18th century, was physically isolating and really difficult for enslaved people. It made it very difficult for enslaved people to form relationships with each other because the enslaved population was very low as compared to a city like Philadelphia where it was higher. So obviously there's daily trauma that enslaved people are enduring because slavery was an oppressive and violent system. Another thing that made slavery here unique was that slave owners like Samuel Morgan would have worked alongside the people that they enslaved. A lot of people might know about slavery through popular images of southern plantations, for example, where you might have a slave owner who's not doing any work and sitting in a plantation house where there are 100 enslaved people working in different capacities. Here it was a lot different. So historians say there are universal things that are common to slavery throughout the United States and through the Atlantic world, but also that slavery is site-specific and that it changes with each geography that you go to and who you're talking about. These are sheep, obviously not from the 18th century. This is from another historic site. So to get to the specific daily life of Jack and Chloe and the Morgans, we can use the estate inventory of Samuel Morgan to try to piece together their material worlds. What objects did they have? What was the house like? What was in the barn? What kind of farm tools did they use? What kind of livestock were they raising? So this is his estate inventory. When Samuel Morgan died, his kind of assessors and inheritors hired someone to go through all the pieces of his property and say, okay, he has a case of table and drawers, an oval table, he has a tea table, he has a desk, a poplar chest, a looking glass, a mirror, a quantity of wool, a quantity of feathers. This is all what we have transcribed from this 18th century document. And then, of course, here are Jack and Chloe, whose names we know from the slave bill of sale. But here in the estate inventory, they're just objectified as enslaved people, as slaves, as, quote, a young Negro lad and Negro wench who are worth 100 pounds. So when we add up some of the other pieces of Samuel Morgan's property, 48 sheep, 9 pigs, 22 cows, 5 horses, they're actually worth more in 1759 than Jack and Chloe were valued at. They were only valued at 100 pounds. So this is to kind of highlight the dehumanization inherent in slavery, that people are being turned into objects by white authorities and white enslavers. But at the same time, enslaved people are resisting. They're not accepting their realities and that they are pieces of property. They're also human beings. So there's all these contradictions when we study slavery in general, and with this specific case as well. What I want to highlight with this section is a lot of people don't know that slaves, quote unquote, were enslaved people. So historians have argued that the terminology we use when talking about slavery is important because it can reify dehumanization of slavery, or it can actually help to bring more humanity back to people who had to live under enslavement. This section is also to kind of highlight that enslaved people resisted bondage. They did not accept their conditions, and that they were full, dynamic, three-dimensional human beings, not just a, quote, Negro lad in Samuel Morgan's estate inventory. So they resisted, historians say, in many different ways, just by surviving. The fact that that Jack and Chloe ended up in the estate inventory after the years of enslavement, still alive, is a testament to their daily survival. They were taking care of themselves. They might have slowed in work. And Jack, in 1770, took a really dramatic move and escaped. And in response, John Morgan, who was now the lawful owner of Jack, per Samuel Morgan's will, posted this fugitive slave advertisement to try to get him back. Has anybody seen these kinds of documents before? Okay, so they're more well known than the slave bill of sale. So the purpose of the ad was to advertise the enslaved person, to describe them with a good deal of truthfulness, because the white authors of them wanted other white people in the area to be able to identify their enslaved people and bring them back, and they would get a reward. So this advertisement, John Morgan says, ran away from the subscriber, him, living in Radnor Township, Chester County, 24th September last, a Negro man named Jack, about 5 feet 8 inches high. He's about 27 years of age. And this is what he had on, according to Morgan, when he ran away. A half-worn felt hat, a brown homespun cloth jacket with pewter buttons, an undershirt of the same, ditto meaning the same, a shirt, pants. Whoever takes up and secures said Negro so that his master may have him again shall have 30 shillings reward paid by John Morgan. We don't know the exact circumstances of Jack's escape. Did he escape in the morning? Did he have a plan? Was it random? Did he have help from someone? Did he escape before and John Morgan just didn't post an advertisement? Because enslaved people oftentimes ran away and escaped multiple times, but slave owners didn't necessarily always write and pay to post an advertisement in a newspaper to get them back. And newspapers were not printed every day. So there's kind of a time kind of lag sometimes between when the advertisement was actually posted in the newspaper and when the person says they ran away. So September 24th is when he ran away, but this advertisement's only in the paper, Pennsylvania Gazette, which was owned by Benjamin Franklin, on October 7th. So think about this moment. And Jack, he's enslaved. There are very few people around here. It's a lot of woods, farm animals. The only people you're really interacting with day to day are the person who's enslaving you, maybe one other enslaved person. What could he have been thinking? What kind of emotions were going through his head, his mind, when he chose to escape? I mean, this is a really dangerous act because by law, any white person can stop, detain, beat, do whatever they want to any black person they see, free, enslaved or not, in Pennsylvania, in Radnor Township, in Philadelphia, in the United States. So this was really dangerous. It's likely that he was recaptured because Magdalene Morgan, John's mother, posted an advertisement 3 years later advertising an enslaved man who pretty much matches Jack's description. He's 27, he was bred to be a farmer. Now, this advertisement, though, doesn't say, hey, I'm selling this guy Jack who ran away 3 years ago. And this could have been another enslaved man, but based off of tax records, which we saw in the beginning, there weren't more enslaved people than about 2 that Magdalene Morgan and John Morgan enslaved at this time. So that's why we think this is likely the same person. But we don't know for sure, but it's unlikely in the reverse that it's not the same guy because they didn't enslave more people. So that's kind of where Jack leaves the archival record. There are no real other sources about him. But there is another person that John Morgan enslaved named George, and we know this because the Morgan family were Quakers. And by 1776, Quaker leadership in Philadelphia pretty much told all the local Quakers, hey, you know what, we've debated slavery for about 100 years. We've talked about it. You know, we said you can't really engage in the slave trade. Now we're pretty much saying if you don't free the people you enslave by 1776, you can't be an official Quaker. We're just going to kick you out. You can do whatever you want, but we're going to try to help you, get to that point. So the leadership formed committees of other Quakers that would go and visit Quakers like John Morgan, who were still slave owners, in places like Radnor Township, and they would meet with them and say, hey, John, we know that you're still enslaving this guy, but, the Quakers, we say this, and you can't hold another person in bondage and still be a Christian. But people like John Morgan were really resisting it. The Quaker leadership said officially 1776 or nothing, but historians of this phenomenon have kind of discovered that it was really drawn out and contested process. Committees would go to people and they wouldn't be home conveniently. Or they would go, and the person who they were talking to would pretty much say, get out of my house. I don't want to hear it. I'm going to still enslave. To hell with it. I don't care. And this is in Quaker meeting minutes, not in that language, but I mean, that would really not be Quaker. But so John Morgan eventually agreed with them in 1779. This is a manumission document for an enslaved person. How many people have seen this kind of document? So this is a document written by the Quakers that says this person is officially free. But, of course, there's another caveat. Morgan said that he really wouldn't be free until he reached a certain age. I forget what it was. This document, he says, John Morgan says, I'll free George, but in about 3 years, because I still need his time, and he's still young, and he's not ready for freedom. That was kind of the thinking. So that's how we know about George. There's no tax assessment that shows that George is enslaved. There's no runaway ad. There's no slave bill of sale. There's no other document besides this. So that's how we know that he enslaved George, only because he freed him. If he didn't agree to this manumission, we might not know George's name or that he was ever enslaved at all. In 1790, John Morgan was still a slave owner. So this is one of the parts that has confused us at the project, because he's supposed to free George, but then the census, the first census of the United States in 1790, which also recorded slave owners, how many slaves people owned, he's right here, John Morgan, and he has one slave in Radnor Township. But the way that this document was created was just to record this enslaved person as someone's property. Nothing about their identity, their name, who they are, anything about their life. So we really don't know who that person is. Is that George? Was it Jack? Did they ever really sell Jack in 1773? Maybe it's Chloe. Then my thinking is, why would it be Chloe if Magdalene Morgan was the legal owner? But maybe because he was a white guy and the law didn't recognize independent white women as property owners a lot of times. So this is one of the parts to highlight too, that our research is always ongoing. We don't have all the answers, and we're not 100% sure of things, but we do have a lot of evidence that leads us to certain conclusions. Magdalene Morgan, John's mother, died in 1798, and her will, which we have up here, she talks about Chloe very briefly. So Chloe is still alive in 1798. So she has survived in the Morgan's farm for that long. She says in her will, blah, 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 talking about the daughters. She gives all her stuff to her daughters. Beds, feathers, chests of drawers, a riding horse. And then she says, to be left at my daughter Sarah Johnson's discretion to provide as she may think fit for my Negro woman Chloe. So we're kind of confused again. Does this mean that Chloe is free? Is she enslaved? What does my Negro woman Chloe mean? Did Magdalene Morgan just refer to her as that, even though she might have been free? Or did that mean she was enslaved? It's unclear from the document. So kind of to wrap up, we know that the Morgans owned the land that later became Villanova from deed records. John Morgan sold this land of the Morgan family, a big part of it, to a tavern keeper named Jonathan Miller in 1801. And then here's kind of a timeline that pushes us closer to when the Augustinians acquired the property. Miller sells it to John Rudolph, who Nolan's going to talk about in 1806, and eventually the Augustinians bought it for $18,000 in 1842. So this is kind of just to put some of these pieces together in chronology. This image, the idea behind this is, part of the project, we want the Villanova community to think about what this all means. That slavery is a part of Villanova's history before Villanova existed. The Augustinians didn't enslave anyone. William Molden, who Nolan's going to talk about, was not enslaved. He had an indenture. But all of this other history happened almost 100 years before, and Chloe, Jack, and George changed the landscape. They impacted the space that later became Villanova. They increased the value of the property that the Augustinians later acquired. And there's violence, there's complication, there's all of these emotions wrapped up into this history of slavery. That's all happened where we are now. And the biggest challenge is the landscape today is totally different. There are no physical remains of the Morgan's farm or their house or their livestock. We have a highway, we have the train, we have buildings. It's hard to reimagine and see the history of slavery in this space now because it's so different. So now we're going to go to Nolan, back to Nolan.
We're just going to have to switch the mic again. Thank you. Okay, and the reason for all the switching around is because Colin's research sort of ties nicely chronologically then into the next part of the research, which initially was done, as I said, by Angie Lincoln as part of the history department here at Villanova, and focuses on William and Julia Molden and their active participation in the founding of Villanova College. And as you will see from the research, the Moldens are important figures in the history of Villanova, whose labor helped establish the monastery and the college, and whose philanthropy helped further the mission of the Villanova community. And before I really dive into everything, I just want to point to much of the sources that I'm going to be using for my part of the presentation. So first and foremost, Angie Lincoln's article, Remembering William Molden, is fully on the life of William Molden, including Julia Molden, their children, their life off of campus, their life on campus. It's very good if you want more reading on the Moldens themselves. Also, I want to point to, this is a screenshot of our website, rootedproject.org. And all of the, much like Colin had, I have pictures of documents that I'm going to be showing you. All of the pictures I've pulled, of the documents at least, I've pulled from our website, which you can find on the Archives tab. We have other documents on there. We have a full timeline of William and Julia Molden, when they were here, when they moved off of campus. We also have Colin's research on slavery here on the property of Villanova. And then we also have some really interesting research done by a lot of Villanova history students along with the project on former students in the 19th century here whose families were actually enslavers in the South, and then they came up to attend college here at Villanova. So there's a whole bunch of other research that's going on at the project beyond just these two individual topics. So if you are interested in that, please visit our website. And then lastly, I just wanted to point to the Falvey Library's digital collections. Any picture that I'm going to be using that shows the expansion of campus, the campus over time, those are all pulled from here. So definitely look through those collections if you're interested in more on all of this. So William Molden was born in 1818 in Philadelphia. His mother Mary was enslaved to the family of John Rudolph, who Colin just mentioned, bought the property that we now stand on, meaning that William was born into what was called term slavery. At the time, Pennsylvania's gradual emancipation law allowed the children born to enslaved mothers to legally serve as indentured servants until the age of 28. So William Molden would be an indentured servant to John Rudolph until he turned 28, and this was part of Pennsylvania's gradual emancipation law, which started in 1780 and lasted all the way through about the middle of the 19th century. John Rudolph owned a property named Bel Air in Radnor Township, where we stand. From a young age, William worked the Bel Air property under term slavery. In 1836, John Rudolph married Jane Lloyd, who was the daughter of a prominent Catholic family in Philadelphia. But only 2 years later, John Rudolph had died, and his death likely changed William Molden's life trajectory, as 2 years later, William Molden would be freed by Jane Rudolph, this was in 1840, which was 6 years ahead of time, 6 years prior to when his legal manumission date would have occurred through the gradual emancipation law. And this is the certificate of freedom signed by Jane Rudolph for William Molden. It's dated March 29th, 1841, but it states William Molden was freed September 5th in 1840, having faithfully discharged his engagements to Mr. John Rudolph. Molden's life would soon take another positive change for the better, as he married Julia Thompson on February 21st, 1841. Born in 1820, Julia spent her childhood in the home of Priscilla Thomas in Upper Gulf Township, Montgomery County. Like William, Julia had been baptized into the Catholic faith, and the two were wed in a Catholic ceremony at St. Dennis's in Havertown. Jane Rudolph actually hosted the couple's wedding dinner at Bel Air. And just a note here, because there are a lot of, in some of these records, Julia is sometimes referenced as Juliana, Julianne. There's various ways that people write down her name, but we have tracked all of this. And also it's Thomas, sorry, not Thompson. Sometimes names are mixed up, but we have tracked all of this and are sure that this Julia is in fact the same Julia. The Moldens' relationship with Jane Rudolph, let me go back. The Moldens' relationship with Jane Rudolph extended to business matters as well. Between 1840 and 1842, so William Molden is now free, while still living at Bel Air, William entered into 3 separate labor contracts with Jane Rudolph. As Molden was living at Bel Air, these arrangements are similar to the cottager system common to Pennsylvania at the time. Molden's available business records show his willingness to engage in labor contracts with multiple others as well, including Priscilla Thomas, St. Dennis's Church, and others in the local area. In 1852, Bel Air was sold to the Brotherhood of the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine. Jane Rudolph would continue living at the Bel Air mansion until members of the monastic community officially moved in the following year, in 1843. The Moldens, however, continued living on the property at Bel Air even after Jane Rudolph had left, helping ensure the proper management of the livestock and crops on the property. Both William and Julia Molden were employed by the Augustinian community on various contracts and were regularly being paid for their labor throughout the property. This labor that the Moldens provided for the Augustinian community is crucial at this time, given the plans of the Augustinian community to support the college and the property primarily on the profits of the farm until the college could financially support itself. Providing for the family became even more important to William and Julia Molden in 1843 as they welcomed their daughter Mary into the world. While the Moldens reportedly bore 13 children, only 3 would survive into adulthood, with Mary being their oldest surviving child. 2 weeks after her birth, Mary was also baptized in the Catholic faith at St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Norristown. As the Moldens tended to their family, Villanova College welcomed their first class of students in the fall of 1843 and began expanding the campus. Now, when the campus started, there were just the buildings that belonged to the Rudolph family. So the main building that was used as both the college and the monastery was the Bel Air mansion. Now, big building, but not quite big enough for everyone, so soon they needed to expand. And by 1844, a new chapel had been erected near the Bel Air mansion in order to house students, make use for classrooms, and also serve as a chapel on the weekends. Plans were also quickly put into place to erect a building to house the college, separate from the monastery, with intentions of expanding this college building as need permitted in the future. While investment was being made in the physical structures of the college, little is known of the Moldens' living space, which was, again, here on the property. Where they lived on the property was referred to as Mount Misery due to its appearance, and the Moldens lived in a log structure atop a small hill, near the location where Gary Hall now stands. So across, I don't know where I am in this building, but across the train tracks, where Gary Hall now stands, there was supposedly, as Colin said, the landscape is totally different than it was back then, but there was a little hill right there. Apparently there was also a brook with a spring, and that's where the Moldens would have lived in a log structure. There were also some other smaller farm buildings out that way. Let's see where I am. So as I said, a small spring in the area most likely gave the Moldens their water source, as this spring would later provide water to numerous buildings on campus as it continued to grow. And the stone from an old barn on Mount Misery was actually used to construct that chapel in 1844. So this is a picture, again, from the Falvey Library's digital collections of what Villanova College would have looked like in 1849. So moving from left to the right, and we're actually facing it as if we were on Lancaster Pike right now. So from left to right, this is the chapel that was built that was in the previous picture. This would be the Bel Air mansion, which was original to the property upon the sale and the purchase by the Augustinians. This building is the new college building where all of the classes would have moved to. In that sense, in a future picture, we're going to see they really expand it even further between 1849 and 1890. And then the building on the far right is actually the main barn. So that's where all of the equipment would have been stored, all of the livestock that was raised here on the property. That's where the Moldens would have stored all of their equipment while they worked the property here at Villanova. While Villanova expanded, William Molden continued to save his earnings, and in 1847, he had enough to buy 3 acres in the Rosemont neighborhood of Lower Merion Township, just a short distance from Villanova. The property had previously been owned by Priscilla Thomas, with whom Julia Molden had spent her childhood. A small 2-story home was soon built on the property, and by the summer of 1849, the Moldens moved from Villanova to their new home. Molden soon opened a small store on the property, and Father Thomas Middleton notes in his history of early Villanova community that the students would be led by the Augustinians to the Moldens' property in order to buy sweets and other candies, other things that they could afford in the store. And Molden would later open a tavern on this property. And I didn't mention, but this is the deed of the Rosemont property that Priscilla Thomas sold to William Molden for $300. And then here is the contract to build William and Julia Molden's new home, which was for $345. Very specific about how many windows, the doors, everything else is all in here. Over the next several decades, the Moldens would live on this property as Lower Merion Township would see massive growth and development. Around 1870, there were only a handful of landowners in this area, but by 1890, Lower Merion Township had grown to include a population of over 10,000. While Molden's property in Rosemont had initially been one of the smallest tracts in the area, by 1890 it was one of the largest, leading to a large increase in the wealth of the Moldens. While a time of growth for the area, this also led to personal hardships for the Moldens. As a small farmer and tavern keeper, Molden would be the target of legal proceedings at least 3 times between 1878 and 1886. Although free and landowners, the Moldens dealt with what was likely racially driven antagonism by their neighbors in the late 19th century. One of these instances came when Molden was accused of keeping his property in a, quote, filthy condition, leading to a drainage problem within the area's water supply. The newly formed Pennsylvania State Board of Health investigated. They actually first charged Molden with this issue, and then under further investigation, they quickly found out that the issue was not caused by Molden and another person who was accused of the same issue, but it was caused by the failure of the township's sanitation division to keep up with the growth in population, not Molden. In 1886, at the age of 68, William Molden drew up a will in which he appointed Father Francis Sheeran, then president of Villanova College, the executor. In the will, Molden stipulated that upon his death, his property would be given to Father Sheeran, but made arrangements for his family to live on the property throughout the remainder of their lives. Upon their deaths, the property would be conveyed to the Augustinian College of Villanova. No available records indicate the relationship between Father Sheeran and William Molden, but it's clear that the relationship between the Moldens and the Augustinians at least remained close over the nearly 40 years since the Moldens left Villanova. And this is the final page of that will. It's a 3-page will. William Molden was not able to write at the time, so this is his mark, and we don't know who actually drew up this will, but this is stipulated by him and marked by him, giving his property over to the college. And on February 27th, 1888, Julia Molden died at the age of 68, and 5 years later, at the age of 75, William Molden passed away. Upon his death, the will Molden had written in 1886 went into effect, but its stipulations for his family were soon overshadowed by the death of his daughter, Mary, which was their last remaining child. She passed away in 1898. And here we have the death notices for both Julia Molden in 1888 and William Molden in 1893. Now having full control of the property, the Augustinian community sold the Moldens' Rosemont property for $14,000 in 1899. Over the nearly 50 years the Moldens had owned their Rosemont property, the value of the property had risen by over 4,500%. A lot of this was due to the development and the growth in population, and the fact that they now had a very large tract of land, which they had for a very long time. So here is what Villanova College would have looked like around that time, about a decade prior in 1890. So we're looking from the other way now. Lancaster Pike would be here. We're looking from the train tracks, but still we have the barn, which is right here. This would be the east wing, which we saw in the previous, of the college building, which you saw in the previous picture, with an expansion to that west wing. The chapel is located right here. This is a small gymnasium that they would have used for activities for the students. They had extended also the Bel Air Mansion, which was fully used as the monastery at the time, and then St. Thomas of Villanova Church was also there as well. But this $14,000 that was made by the Villanova College and the monastic community here was actually used into a further expansion of the college. Right in this area, there were 2 new buildings that were built, and they were interconnected. One was a brand new college hall, and the second was a brand new monastery. And the belief in building these was that throughout the 19th century, Villanova had gone through some financial turmoil. There were multiple times when the college actually had to close, the longest of which being from 1857 through the Civil War, and then they reopened after the Civil War. Enrollments were down at this time, near the turn of the century into 1900, and so the then president of Villanova decided to expand the college in order to attract more students. This wouldn't have been possible without the $14,000 and without the property being sold from the Moldens. This was a huge part of that undertaking, which then led to further growth of Villanova over the next 50 years. So throughout their lives, William and Julia Molden helped shape the Villanova community through their labor and involvement in the local community. From the founding of the college, the Moldens helped ensure the growth of the institution. Understanding the imprint of the Moldens on the first 50 years of Villanova College is crucial to understanding the early development and growth of the college. The long-term successes of Villanova is due in part to the Moldens, and we are proud to engage with and present this history in order to acknowledge their commitment to Villanova. And while I have you, this is our Twitter and our Instagram, and that is our website, and we'd love for you to check it out. And that's our presentation, so thank you very much. And we only have one mic, but we're both happy to take questions, so yes.
So the Villanova Augustinians never owned slaves. The Moldens had been slaves of the Rudolphs, but they were free, right?
Yeah, so William Molden, there's nothing to suggest that Julia Molden was ever enslaved. William Molden, however, was part of the gradual emancipation law, so he was an indenture until the age of 28, given Pennsylvania law at the time. So he was already free. He was freed in 1840, and the university, or the property, wasn't deeded to the Augustinian community until 2 years later in 1842.
Well, this cleans up Villanova's reputation, because I thought Villanova was advertising that the Augustinians owned slaves when they began. But that's not true, is it?
No, nothing that we found in any of the records, and none of the research suggests that that was true. Like I said, William Molden was freed by Jane Rudolph in 1840, and even that note, which was written in 1841, but was acknowledging that on September 5th, 1840, he was freed. And since then, there's nothing to suggest that there were others that were enslaved or indentured on this property.
And one more point, if I may, and I'm sorry, I won't take up much time. Harriton, of course, was a slave-holding tobacco plantation over in Bryn Mawr, very large plantation. They used to brag that they had 200 slaves, and by the way, it was the largest tobacco-growing plantation north of the Mason-Dixon line before the Civil War. But I always wondered, did they have 200 at one time, and whatever slaves they had, did they know the Moldens and people like that? You don't know.
That's an interesting question. No, I don't know. I don't know the relationship between the two. I don't know if there's anything else I would suggest, but yeah, no, I don't know anything about that, unfortunately. Other questions? Yeah.
Have you all located the graves of the Moldens at St. Denis Cemetery?
Yes, yeah, we have located the graves, and actually there's a picture of the headstone of both Julia and William Molden's graves on our website. Yeah.
Do you guys know who William Molden's father was?
Yes, we do know who William Molden's father was. William Molden's father was not a slave. He had previously been freed. And I'm going to mess up the pronunciation, but in South Philly it was called Moyamensing, I think. He was Moyamensing, thank you very much. And so he lived in that area. But very little is known other than that. We just know that it is likely that is who his father is. And that, again, there's more information on that on our website in the timeline. Yeah, of course.
So are any of the current buildings here, do they remain, or at least part, like a wall from the 18th century?
That's a really good question. That's something that I'm really interested to see and to really expand this research on, see what buildings are left on campus. I'm not positive. I don't know, Colin, if you know of anything. Obviously, I believe the church is still, as it was. And
I think of the chapel as St. Rita's.
okay. When I was walking on campus earlier today too, I was thinking that as well, but I'm not positive.
I think that's the only one in that last picture that you showed.
Okay.
The church and then St. Rita's.
This.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right behind it.
Yeah, I was also thinking that they look very similar. I don't yet know, but that's something that I'd like to find. And what I would really like to do is we have a map on our website currently. What I'd like to do is show this expansion of campus over time and really place it. Start it with, maybe we can even start it earlier, but start it with Bel Air and Mount Misery, quote unquote, and where the Moldens would have lived and the property as a whole.
When you go to the monastery and you go into the main entrance, the entrance behind Lancaster, there's an original outside stone wall inside the new entrance. And I was just wondering if maybe that was something they kept from way back. Does that make sense?
It could be. That's something I'd certainly want to look into, further research for the project. Yeah. Yes?
Thanks for your work on this, both of you. So you showed Molden Hall there earlier, and the last time I talked to a student who lived in Molden, there was no information on that building anywhere as to who William and Juliana Molden were. Do you know of any plans to at least put some kind of plaque up or some kind of pointer, or even a QR code to your website?
That would be great. Yeah. So as far as we know, this has been a goal of the project from the beginning, right? Trying to get some signage. And yes, to this day, there still is nothing that sort of, lets people know, let students know who live there, why it is named this, who these people are, what their story was, a link to our website, nothing like that. So that is certainly a goal of this project. Hopefully sometime in the near future, that is able to happen. Also, maybe some other like acknowledgments of the fact that these two people, and Chloe, Jack, and George, lived on this property, were here, are part of the Villanova community and its history. And so really that acknowledgement is something that we're really working toward and hoping that, again, sometime in the near future, we can get signage that says, this is Molden Hall and this is who these people were and this is why it's important to the Villanova community and this is why it's important that you know it as a Villanovan, right?
Yeah, it just occurred to me that those apartments were built in the 80s, if I'm correct, late 80s. So clearly they knew who Molden was.
Sure. And Molden Hall is actually right next to Rudolph Hall.
Do you know any history of that? Do you guys know any of the history of how that name got put on that building? Because that would be an interesting question. Because obviously someone knew these people.
Right.
And then they disappeared until you get this project started. You know what
Right.
I mean?
So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, according to Angelina Lincoln's interview with Father Robert Stack, the Molden name on the dorm was a placeholder name, similar to the ones that they have in the Commons. And then it never was changed to a donor's name. And so it wasn't really supposed to be.
Interesting.
And that's according to Father Stack, by way of Angelina Lincoln. One thing I did want to mention is that Dean Adele Lindenmeyer recently became the William and Julia Molden Endowed Dean of College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And so there has been at least one move by the college and the university to acknowledge William and Julia Molden in that way.
Yes. Yeah, yes, and thank you for mentioning that. And also, there are two histories of Villanova, one from the 1890s written by Father Thomas Middleton, another one written in the 1990s by Paul Contasta, and both do mention the Moldens, but they don't sort of look at their lives and explain what their lives meant to the community, right? They don't really follow the trail of records that show that they sold their property, which was at the time worth a pretty penny, right, to the college, which was struggling and was trying to build and expand at the time, and so the history is there, right? But it wasn't all put together, at least in terms of this story and this viewing of it. So, yeah.
If you look at the history of Lower Merion Township, you'll find a great deal about Mill Creek, because in the colonial period, there were many factories on Mill Creek run by water power. One of them was the factory where the paper for the Declaration of Independence was created. Another factory during the Civil War was a factory where they manufactured muskets. But at any rate, it says in that history that Mill Creek begins in a spring on Villanova's property. When you described the spring near Mount Misery, it was probably that, because it's in the marshy area. There's Gary Hall, the old law school, then the new law school.
Yeah.
Then there's fields, right? And the fields hold water. That apparently is where Mill Creek begins. So we're important to colonial industry because of those factories.
Interesting. Yeah, that is certainly something that, I mean, again, the landscape is entirely different than it was at this time. But really sort of placing all of these structures and where we are, in this location, I think is really important. And so that's why, hopefully down the road, we can get a map that really shows the expansion of the college. Perfect.
I'm sorry to ask more questions, but I want to touch on something that you glanced over, and because it wasn't a focus of this, but I want to mark it just for all of us that there's people doing research on students from families whose wealth was created by enslaved people who came to Villanova and paid tuition. So the financial livelihood of Villanova is in part built on the backs of enslaved people.
Yes.
And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
Yes. Yeah. And thank you for highlighting that. Again, the Molden story, right, and slavery on the location prior to Villanova, right? These are all just pieces of the larger project, right? And that's such an interesting piece of it, the students' part in the 19th century. And again, those are all. And the best part about it is we're getting current students, right, most of the time, that are writing these histories, that are engaging with these histories, that are engaging with the primary documents that we were just showing, right, to really tell this history. And so I really encourage everyone here to go to the website and read through those and get a better sense of what this all means to Villanova's history. Cool. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.